Today, introducing Asbestos Awareness Australia. This show coincides with the formal launching of Asbestos Awareness Australia Limited, which is a registered not-for-profit company, limited by guarantee, a registered charity, and which has endorsement from the Australian Taxation Office as its gift deductible recipient. And we're going to start with a very telling quote from Jock McCulloch, Asbestos, Its Human Cost, which was published in 1986. He said, "The politicization of science is used by the industry to immobilise debate by excluding the victims and the public from participation in the conflict. That exclusion is a political strategy which is rarely, if ever, justified by the nature of the explanation involved or by the methodology physicians use in researching diseases and their cause. What needs to be done is to transfer the asbestos controversy into the public arena so that the issue is no longer seen or defined as a technical problem for experts in the legal, medical, technocratic and bureaucratic spheres to debate unhindered by an informed public." The harms of legacy or in situ asbestos in Australia were created in Australia during the 20th century, with expansive distribution of asbestos-containing products manufactured by James Hardie Industries Limited, we'll call them James Hardie, and CSR Limited, we'll call them CSR, and others until the 1980s. The powers that be allowed these activities to continue despite irrefutable evidence of the deaths caused by exposure to its carcinogenic fibres. Today, Australia as a nation is still experiencing and acquiescing to mass deaths during the 21st century from largely or entirely preventable asbestos-related disease. Legacy asbestos now sits or lurks in government, commercial and residential properties in various forms and continues to pose real and substantive lethal threats to the public. Actions taken by James Hardie and CSR to prevent ongoing loss of life in Australia were and remain minimal, given the scale of lives still at stake. And more broadly, actions taken by all levels of government to protect the health and lives of Australians seems inadequate and highly complacent, especially in residential settings. Our survey of 43,000 households found that very few Australians were properly aware of the nature, gravity and magnitude of the harms posed from legacy asbestos and are taking appropriate precautions to save their own and others' lives. Indeed, most lacked basic knowledge about asbestos dangers and consequence. More than 2/3 did not know what asbestos is, thought that it was not dangerous to health, or were unsure whether it is dangerous to health. Among those who did know that asbestos is dangerous to health, most were unaware that, firstly, there is no safe level of exposure to asbestos. Second, the most harmful effect of asbestos exposure is death. Third, that more than 1,000 Australians die from asbestos-related disease each year. Asbestos Awareness Australia Limited is a registered charity. It's run entirely by volunteers and had received no external funding at the time the website was launched. Asbestos Awareness Australia was set up to enhance public awareness and knowledge of the dangers of asbestos threats, to promote measures and policies that prevent or minimise the harms from asbestos-related disease. And to achieve these objectives, the company provides public access to widely sourced information on asbestos risks and impacts, including the associated medical, legal and political debates. While pieces of the asbestos story are available from other public sources and academic publications, the broader legal, political and medical context and evidence is commonly lacking. Without this context and evidence, the magnitude of the asbestos crisis and its horrific consequential harms appear to be poorly understood by scholars, policymakers, public health officials and the community at large. There are a bunch of misconceptions, and our research confirms that the playbooks and public relations strategies of the asbestos industry and its supporters since the 1970s have been to promote the following messages within public forums. First, the incidence of and deaths from asbestos-related diseases are rare. Second, the number of historical deaths from asbestos-related diseases are uncertain. Third, asbestos-related disease require or usually involve intense exposure over long periods. Fourth, asbestos-related diseases are solely or primarily caused by occupational exposures. Fifth, cases of asbestos-related disease today reflect historical settings that no longer exist. Sixth, legacy asbestos products that are bonded or encased are safe and best left in position. 7, it is safer to manage than to remove in situ asbestos. 8, most exposure of the general Australian population to asbestos, including the incidental exposure levels used in scientific modelling, is caused by naturally occurring asbestos. 9, public health messaging on asbestos risk should be disseminated on a limited basis so as not to scare the community. These same or similar messages are still reflected in scholarly and official material in Australia and elsewhere, and are at best misconceptions and at worst misleading. Overall, our research suggests that the present public messaging on asbestos risks in Australia is carefully controlled, played down and qualified. Public knowledge and awareness of legacy asbestos risks and impacts is very poor. There have been no nationally coordinated mass media public health campaigns or warnings in Australia on asbestos risks, and dissemination of existing public health guidance on asbestos threats is highly restricted, and the public health messaging available within public forums does not properly reflect the science on asbestos, is a long way from being best practice from a public health perspective, and is politically and commercially motivated. An open debate by scholars, policymakers and the media on the optimal public health framework to save lives from asbestos-related disease is lacking, and the actions by the federal and state governments and local councils to date to minimise deaths from asbestos-related disease appear minimal given the gravity and magnitude of harm involved. Clear and transparent rationales to explain such inaction are lacking, and there are veils of silence and suppression in Australia over asbestos management and policy issues. As law professors and experienced financial and policy analysts, we conclude that the present public health and risk policy settings is a deadly cocktail with well-known but preventable outcomes. There's very poor level of public awareness of asbestos threats. There's inadequate regulation governing the handling and control of asbestos in residential settings. There's a lack of systematic identification, risk management and eradication of legacy asbestos around our built environment. Despite claims or implications to the contrary, there are no zero risk or safe policy or public health settings, including the present ones, to resolve the threats of legacy asbestos across Australia. Only less worse options that on balance save the most lives. Some policy progress has been made over the last 20 years with the banning of new asbestos products in Australia and the introduction of workplace safety obligations around the handling and control of asbestos in employment settings. However, substantive progress since then to minimise fatalities from asbestos-related diseases has seemingly stalled or regressed. And we question whether any substantive lessons have been learnt by the public health sector and policymakers in Australia over the last century. We contend that the old asbestos game continues, with people's lives still being traded off for short-term political and commercial gain. Our research suggests these trade-offs are rarely stated explicitly, but are instead carefully masked and or hidden from public view. For more than a century now, the scales of justice have allowed corporations and governments to largely sit by passively, while tens of thousands of Australians have died and continue to die from exposure to asbestos without transparent accountability and appropriate repercussions. It's shocking that many Australians still only find out about the consequences of harmful exposure to asbestos after they've been diagnosed with diseases that are statistically likely to kill them within months. At this point, victims have little hope to cling to because their disease has been among the most poorly funded of all cancers in Australia. Their peace of mind in the last stages of their lives is made worse, knowing that their disease was entirely preventable. These sufferers might receive some compensation, but many do not, and the pool of uncompensated victims will likely increase over time as evidence of prior exposure sources becomes more difficult. Battles regarding the publicly available information on asbestos matters are long-standing and reminds us of the biblical story of David and Goliath. The resources, power and weapons of the industry and other moneyed interests are immense. In contrast, those who are willing or able to speak out unequivocally or advocate openly on behalf of unwitting victims appears to be weak and meagerly funded, at least outwardly so. We seek brave souls willing to help us speak truth to power and shift the focus to actions that serve the public interest. Our ultimate aim is to avoid senseless loss of life to preventable disease. The facts, evidence and science that necessitate urgent public health and policy action to save lives from asbestos-related disease are to hand and have been to hand for many decades. Evidence of deaths from mesothelioma following brief periods and low dosages of exposure were highlighted repeatedly in medical and social science journals in the 1960s. Senior executives at James Hardie and CSR, public health experts and policy leaders were made aware or ought to have been aware of these developments. Yet in 2021, unequivocal and public acknowledgement of these facts by the industry, the public health sector and policy leaders is still lacking. It is well beyond time for the industry, policymakers of all persuasions and the media to be upfront and honest with the community about death counts from asbestos-related diseases, the ongoing threat from in situ asbestos and the related financial decisions and consequences. Public acknowledgement of asbestos matters is essential to pay proper respect to the tens of thousands of Australians who have died from this man-made disaster and to provide an appropriate baseline from which to consider optimal policy steps to save lives during the 21st century. The Asbestos Management Review report noted that one of the primary responsibilities of government is to protect its citizens from known and potential hazards, especially when those hazards result from the previous implementation of government programs and policy. Despite the strength and candour of this view, Australia still lacks prudent and proportionate public health warnings and policy settings to prevent deadly exposure to asbestos. We ultimately call for the following steps and reforms. Firstly, nationally coordinated public health campaigns that warn about the specific risks and deadliness of exposure to the legacy asbestos. Secondly, compulsory residential property asbestos assessment prior to sale, renovation or lease. Third, legal requirements for residential property owners to have all asbestos removed by licensed professionals. Fourth, the introduction of interest-free loans, means tested, for residential property owners to support the removal of asbestos by licensed professionals. And fifth, urgent and firm commitments to eradicate asbestos from public, commercial and residential properties across Australia. These proposals are not new. The Asbestos Management Review made similar recommendations back in 2012. However, none of its key recommendations have been fully adopted other than the establishment of a federal coordinating body, the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. Our research and experiences suggest opposition to our proposed measures and reforms is largely, if not entirely, centred on financial concerns. Yet the financial cost to remediate or eradicate legacy asbestos across Australia will be incurred at some point. The only questions are when, by whom, and the extent of suffering and deaths involved in the meantime. So the seminal questions now are: 1. When will the industry, federal and state leaders, the public health sector, lawyers, scholars and the media finally acknowledge the facts and evidence of the asbestos crisis unequivocally and publicly? Second, when will the industry, federal and state leaders and the public health sector take preventative actions that are prudent and proportionate given the scale of lives still at risk? The longer these steps take, the greater the accountability of these cohorts for the avoidable lives lost. As experienced researchers, we'll attempt to ensure ongoing debates that are respectful, well-informed and transparent. And do notify us of any error of fact, we will quickly rectify them. But if you have or are aware of additional material that should be referenced, made available or updated on the website, please let us know. Submitted facts or claims made in material provided should provide verifiable sources, state the assumptions made, and or indicate any conflicts of interest, including relevant external funding. And please note that we strongly refute assertions that asbestos matters can only be discussed by experts nominated by moneyed and political interests, particularly when these experts are anonymous and cannot be held to account for claims made. And we further reject the familiar response from these interested parties that any evidence or claim made on behalf of asbestos-related sufferers is overly emotional, is exaggerated or imbalanced, or can be readily dismissed as unscientific. Indeed, we wonder whether it is possible to truly convey or exaggerate the scale of unnecessary loss and suffering created by asbestos-related activities in Australia. Now turning to our content, the Asbestos Awareness Australia website begins by compiling and referencing content from publicly available sources and the medical, political, historical and legal literatures. We acknowledge the prior efforts and material of journalists, scholars, lawyers and others who've spoken out on asbestos-related matters over the last century, especially the work of Jock McCulloch, Geoffrey Tweedle and Matt Peacock. Publication of this material required and still requires courage, as many sources cite examples of the industry and its supporters providing funding or creating positions in return for silence, or using threats against or disparaging employees, researchers, doctors, lawyers and plaintiffs. Our researchers seek to analyse and contribute to the existing mosaic of information to better understand the nature and scope of the harms caused by asbestos-related disease in Australia, the reasons why the public is still so poorly informed about asbestos matters, the medical framework and commercial influences underpinning the present policy and public health settings around asbestos. We struggled to find sourced information that addressed the following critical questions. How many deaths have been in Australia from asbestos-related disease, both past and present? How does the magnitude of these deaths compare with other public health risk diseases and events? What are the comparative survival rates of mesothelioma and lung cancer versus other forms of cancer? Turning to the science, what are the largely agreed scientific facts on asbestos-related disease, and what are the uncertainties and unknowns, and why is progress on asbestos-related science so apparently slow? And then, considering public health and policy frameworks, what are the identified risks of asbestos within public, commercial and residential properties in Australia? What are the concrete plans and commitments to manage and or eradicate legacy asbestos across Australia? What are the policies and commitments in place today to prevent ongoing exposure and deaths from asbestos-related disease? And to what extent are public health officials and medical researchers highlighting the dangers and consequences of asbestos threats? And what health guidance, warnings and advice around asbestos dangers is publicly available, and how effective is this material? And are the public health and safety policies and risk management practices around asbestos prudent and proportionate? And are the paramount concerns of the public health and safety frameworks around asbestos to protect the public and to minimise the loss of life? And what are the objective levels of awareness and knowledge of asbestos threats and consequences across the Australian community? And then turning to commercial interests, how much funding has been and is provided by companies that previously produced asbestos-containing materials to the industry for research of asbestos-related disease? How much funding has been and is provided by federal and state governments and by cancer bodies for research of asbestos-related diseases? What are the ongoing and long-term financial burdens of asbestos-related disease? And to what extent is the current information, guidance, public health and safety policy and research funding around asbestos still influenced by vested commercial and political interests? Now let me talk about truth-telling and the voice of sufferers. Because we've got to ask the question, have opportunities for truth-telling on asbestos matters occurred in Australia? Have the voices of those who are suffering from asbestos-related diseases or those who've died from these diseases been heard on national Australian platforms? Our research suggests all these topics have been suppressed within public forums and are barely discussed or not debated at all in academic circles. Most of the existing literature is limited to discussion on medical or compensation issues. Our research has found no peer-reviewed articles in Australia from any discipline that detail the full history of asbestos in Australia, the long-term human and societal harms resulting from legacy asbestos, the responses by the industry and the federal and state governments to asbestos fatalities and ongoing risks, or the legal or public health settings governing legacy asbestos in homes. Answering these questions, or at least acknowledgement of the need to publicly debate these matters, are fundamental to properly comprehending the true scale and burdens of the asbestos crisis and to save lives. Without an understanding of these matters, the status quo settings will likely continue and thousands more Australian lives will be lost needlessly from preventable disease. This belief forms the fire in the belly of our researchers and is the foundation driving the establishment of the company. Our primary aim is to prevent future occurrences of harmful exposure to asbestos and related deaths. Comprehensive discussion of personal injury compensation matters is purposely left to others, as the payment of compensation to sufferers of asbestos-related diseases when this occurs is not equivalent to saving a person's life and should never be thought of as a satisfactory alternative to preventive measures that seek to prevent lethal exposure from occurring. Given a choice, we doubt that any sufferer would opt for compensation rather than the chance to have more years with their family and loved ones. You can find out more about Asbestos Awareness Australia and our research on our website, which is found at asbestosawarenessaustralia.com.au. And on the website there's also information about contacting us and also how you can support us.